Good morning. My name is Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UC San Diego, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this webinar on the presidential recall vote happening in Mexico this coming April 10, this coming Sunday. And we're going to be talking about what is this all about, what is its likely impact, and who benefits and who loses. We have three wonderful panelists, and I want to thank you for being with us. Let me start by introducing you Blanca Heredia. Blanca Heredia is a distinguished professor at CIDE, and she heads the program on policy education, and she's basically trying to make sure that we train leaders for this global world with highly technical skills. Thank you, Blanca, for being with us. We will also have Kate Broom. Kate is the chair at the Political Science Department at UC Santa Barbara, and Kate is a different. We basically have a very, what we believe is a very meaningful program about the well-being of Mexican democratic institutions. We just had a survey, and we have a call for papers, and we're advancing on that, and we believe it's a very strong program about democracy in Mexico, and again, the well-being of democratic institutions. Thank you, Kate, for being such a good friend. And of course, you were many times, I believe at least twice, fellow at the center. So happy to have you here. Three times. Wonderful. And of course, we have Javier Tello. And Javier Tello is currently a fellow at the center. You all know him. He's an analyst, and he's writing a book at USMEX, as we call the center, on the ideology of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. It's a wonderful book. We can't wait to read Javier's book, and I'm very happy that Javier is at USMEX writing this very important book. So let me start with you, Kate. I mean, what is this all about? Could you explain us what is this presidential recall vote? This is the first time happening in Mexico. So just if you could explain us the facts here. Thank you, Kate.
Rafael, and thank you for the invitation. Many democracies have recall procedures in place. We just went through a recall vote in California, where the mechanism is essentially the same. That is, there is a collection of signatures, there are certain requirements about how many states and what percentage of the voting rolls, and then you put on the ballot the motion in this case as to whether the president of Mexico should remain president or should step down. Only if the participation reaches 40% of the eligible voting population will the results be binding. And this is, in most people's view, very unlikely to happen. So the question is, then what is this really all about? Well, this is the first time anything like this has been attempted in Mexico. And one of the very peculiar things about it is that whereas most recall votes are initiated by the opposition to the leader, this one seems to have been initiated by President López Obrador himself and his own political party. They were the ones who gathered most of the signatures putting this on the ballot. This has been a promise of López Obrador's since he was campaigning for the presidency, that he would subject himself to a midterm vote affirming or rejecting his continued leadership. And there are lots of questions about why he would do this. It does not, I don't think most of the more elaborate conspiracy theories about what he's really trying to do here are really logical. I think what he's trying to do here is prove how popular he is. And most of the polls suggest that he will easily achieve a majority of those who turn out to vote. But that's basically what's going on here. And I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you, Kate. Let me give the floor to Blanca. Blanca, yes, I mean, he continues to be a very popular president, and this will be shown next Sunday. What else, Blanca? What is your take on this? And how? I mean, are there any risks for López Obrador? Are there any risks for Mexican democracy? Are there any risks for Mexican democratic institutions?
Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share the table with Kate, with Javier, and with you. I agree with Kathleen about, the general objective of having him on the ballot, the president of Mexico, and hoping to renew and reinvigorate his social base. My sense is that the fundamental objective, however, is to use this as a general rehearsal and a general exam for 2024. In what sense? Particularly in terms of this exercise allowing President Andrés Manuel López Obrador to measure the mobilization ability of his main political cadres and political organizers, that is the governors, mostly the Morena government, the governors from his own party, the 15 states, most probably also some priista governors who are going to go in with him in this. And the test is extremely difficult because he's subjecting them he wants them to show him how much they can get out the vote. As I said, a general rehearsal and general exam for 2024. And I think that the results of this exercise are going to have an important influence in how he decides the positions for 2024 moving forward. As I said, this is not only a general rehearsal and general exam, but it's a general exam done under the most inauspicious conditions. There's no money formally assigned for this exercise in state governments or the legislature. There's also an electorate that is not particularly or highly motivated to vote because it's unclear exactly, what's at stake. So the task for the political operatives of Morena is huge. Recently, the Minister of the Interior, the Secretario de Gobernación in Mexico, and met with the governors and the president himself, and apparently they showed them the numbers of the votes that that Morena had gotten in 2018. Sum total of votes, 30 million. And it was sort of implicitly assumed that that's the goal they're supposed to meet, which is pretty impossible given these conditions. But that's my general sense.
Thank you, Blanca. Javier, what is your take, Javier? And I know, Javier, you were dealing with issues in your computer. This happens in Zoom times. Sometimes we cannot connect. I'm happy that you're here. I'm happy that you were able to solve your connection problems. And so what is your take on this, Javier?
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can listen. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I didn't solve any issues. I was helped by two very kind of people behind me that you might have seen at one point. But thank you very much for the invitation. Very happy to be here with Blanca and Kathleen. I didn't quite hear what Kathleen said at the beginning, but I understand from what Blanca said that she said something about putting AMLO on the ballot and using him, using the recall vote to boost his approval rating in the second half of the sexennial, etc. And I totally agree with that. That's one of the objectives. And then Blanca mentioned as another objective, a rehearsal for 2024. I would agree with that as well. I think the capacity should be, I think what should be at stake is not so much getting out the 30 million votes that he got in 2018, and we can talk about that later on, but the capacity to mobilize the core base. I think 2024, the strategy is who can mobilize the base better. The bet, Morena's bet, is that the opposition doesn't really have a solid sort of base, and they won't be able to mobilize it even if they did have one, whereas Morena can win by mobilizing its base. So this exercise, I think, is an exercise in not getting out all of the votes that they got in 2018. That would be great if it happened, but I think the exercise is one of, can we mobilize our core base, our core constituency? I think there's also a third objective. It wasn't there at the beginning, but it has emerged over time, which is the objective of going after the National Electoral Institute. It's clear that he's also using the recall vote to criticize the National Electoral Institute, to weaken it, to accuse it of being an obstacle for democracy, resisting to implement and to carry out this recall vote in a proper way, etc. So he will use it also to discredit, delegitimize the National Electoral Institute. And then another objective, I think, is also to show his relevance and strength within Morena. It's clear for everybody that he's key to 2024, even though he won't be on the ballot. He will be fluttering around the ballot. Whoever appears on that ballot from Morena, whatever face, whatever name, AMLO needs to be sort of fluttering around it. And one way to make sure that they understand that is to be able to show in this recall vote that he himself is key to getting the vote out. That will strengthen him within Morena. Not only as president in general, but also strengthening him within Morena, I think. And given the infighting that we've seen within Morena over the last few months, and the likelihood that that infighting is likely to increase over the next 2 years, I think that show of strength within Morena is also important.
Thank you, Javier. There's a question here, and let me ask everybody listening to us and seeing us, if you want to ask us questions or make comments, please use the Q&A button. And Luis Manrique is already asking, does the recall have any international observers? And let me ask you, Kate, I wonder, what are your expectations about what are the polls telling us about how many people is coming to vote? And we know that for this to be valid, for this it needs to have 40% of the Mexican electorate to come, which will be very hard. But what is your what are your expectations, Kate, please?
Well, I'm not a pollster, but we have scenarios, one of which is the scenario of the referendum that was held last year over whether or not to punish ex-presidents that received a turnout of only about 7%. And that, as Javier noted, the president was quick to blame on INE and his lack of effort in publicizing the referendum. But I think in this case, the vote will probably be higher, both because the president is putting a lot of his mobilizers to work in getting out the vote, and also because it is inherently a more interesting question for whether or not to recall the president. This is different than whether or not to punish Salinas or something like that. So it's probably higher, but it's almost certainly not 40%. Somewhere in the areas of 20%, I think would be a reasonably good turnout. And that means that, I mean, López Obrador has said that he would step down if the vote doesn't favor him, even if it's not binding, which is, again, unlikely to happen. But that means that he gets to have his demonstration of support for his presidency with relatively low risk. And he can, again, accuse the INE of not sufficiently publicizing the referendum, not putting enough casillas out, even though it's his own government that has denied additional funds to the INE to carry out this exercise. So I think that López Obrador expects to be the big winner in this scenario. The opposition has not managed to unify around a particular strategy, whether or not to abstain and thereby lower the turnout so that it looks really bad for López Obrador, or whether to vote and try to take advantage of this opportunity to recall. The reason there's division is because it doesn't look like they're going to win no matter what they do. So the question is whether they want to lend any kind of legitimacy to the vote by participating, or whether they should just, they should try to take advantage of this opportunity. And the fact that they're divided could have implications as well for 2024. Whether or not they're going to be able to unite again, as they did in 2021, in a coalition against Morena, could be one of the factors that influences whether or not, this could be one of the factors that influences whether or not they can manage to do that.
Thank you, Kate. Blanca, Kate just mentioned that the opposition does not have any strategy. Would you agree with that? And I wonder what is your take on what Javier mentioned as the third goal, which is to make these things difficult for INE, for the National Electoral Institute, to weaken the INE. Would you agree with this goal of the referendum?
Yes, I agree with Javier completely. He's done it repeatedly. He's been attacking in a variety of ways. I must say, however, that, I mean, mostly, not completely, but mostly he has respected the law and the rules. And whenever there have been rulings, he has taken them and accepted them as binding, but he has, continuously sought to weaken INE. For what reason? It's one can speculate. One possibility is that just in case 24 ends up being not as good as he would plan for Morena, he would have again someone to blame for it. And certainly the big pre-announced responsible of low participation in the recall vote next Sunday, which is likely to be small. I agree with Kathleen's estimates, is going to be in it. So you already have the pre-announced culprit of low participation. As to the opposition, I see Kathleen's point. There's a certain division within the opposition, but the institutional opposition, the party opposition, PAN, Movimiento Ciudadano, and PRI and PRD have really agreed upon, non-participation. And there we can discuss as to why they opted for this. My take is that it's basically laziness, and a sense that, they cannot really get out enough votes. And they do more politics in San Angelin. It's nicer, it's cleaner, it's prettier, right? You meet in a nice restaurant and then you agree amongst yourselves and that's it. Going out there, and getting out the vote throughout Mexico's complex territory is a lot of work, and it's Holy Week, and I already have my tickets for Vail or for the Met in New York. So let's do something like not go and vote, and then try to get credit for low participation as if it was against López Obrador. I'm being ironic, but I really think that in part there is laziness and just the lack of something that is part of the central reason of why Andrés Manuel López Obrador won, and the way he won in 2018. You had an opposition then, the kind of a ruling coalition that had really forgotten about territory and about people out there and their real needs and demands. So basically, they've gone for no participation in the vote. And let me just go back to my initial point, because perhaps I wasn't as clear. I think there's many objectives to this recall vote, as Kathleen said, raising Andrés Manuel's popularity and approval rate. But if it were only that, I think it would really not be justified, because he has enough approval. Weakening in it, that perhaps is more interesting. I think the key one is to determine internally within Morena who can get out the vote, whether it's just the core vote, or not. And that is going to be fundamental. And let me end this by saying I think that at least one presidential pre-candidate's fate is at stake next Sunday, and that's Claudia Sheinbaum. If there's a very low participation rate in the recall vote, I think there's a very good chance that she loses her possibility of being a presidential candidate for Morena in 2024.
Thank you, Blanca. Javier, would you agree with this Blanca's read that Claudia Sheinbaum will lose if not many voters will turn out and vote? I believe this is very important. This is about strengthening, not only about strengthening Morena, but also about see who would be the Morena candidate. There's a question here that I would like to read it for you by Arthur Smith, and he says, recently I have seen press speculation that AMLO will try to extend his term in some fashion. in order to save the Cuarta Transformación if no potential Morena presidential candidate demonstrates mobilization power. Do you see anything of this happening, Javier?
No, to the second question, and I'll go back to that final question, but start with what Blanca said. I agree that it's all about a key goal, maybe the key goal, is mobilizing, I would argue, basically the core vote. I don't think the objective can be 30 million. Kate mentioned as a possible reference point the 2021 referendum about former presidents. Those were 6.6 million votes that happened on that day. Another possible reference point is the number of signatures to launch this referendum, which is 11 million votes. In theory, you should have at least 1 million votes of the people who signed up for this reference vote. Another reference point could be the midterm elections in 2021. That's close to 17 million votes. And then finally, the 30 million votes in 2018. So a range between 7 million and 40 million, but certainly above 10 million. Below 10, 11 million, it would be clearly a failure. But I don't think that if they don't mobilize the vote, that Claudia Sheinbaum loses her spot as the #1 contender. I'm assuming that she will be made responsible for the vote within Mexico City. And only that, I would find it hard to understand how she could be blamed if people in Sonora don't vote. But obviously it's a test for her and for all of them. And she will be graded. But I think there are so many other reasons why she, as of today, is the front runner. And I don't think that this alone would be enough to unseat her as the front runner. As for this being a sort of way of preparing re-election, I've never believed in the idea that this is what AMLO was planning to do. Like all presidents, he probably in the very way back of his head, he dreams of re-election, like every single Mexican president has dreamt of re-election. But beyond that, I don't think he has a strategy to do that, or I don't think it is or has been an objective, an explicit objective for López Obrador. The comparisons that are made with other countries where this has happened, I would argue that Mexico is very, very different. It might appear on the very surface to be a similar situation, but I would argue that the context, the history, the institutions, the person in question, i.e. López Obrador, they're all very, very, very different. And I still don't think that this is a strategy that is part of a re-election strategy.
Thank you, Javier. Kate, we're very different until we're not different. I vividly recalled in 2005 when I said that perhaps eventually Mexico could become as violent as Colombia. And somebody from the government called me and told me, you're insane. Mexico will never be more violent than Colombia. Now there's more homicides in Mexico than in Colombia per 100,000 inhabitants. So Kate, would you agree with Javier? I mean, a possibility of re-election is out of the table. And what is your take on weakening INE? We all know that one of the essential problems with US democracy, which is very fragile now, is that it doesn't have a central arbiter, that it doesn't have a national electoral institute. So, I mean, how detrimental could this be of the Mexican democracy if INE just goes very weak?
Well, first of all, I said this before, but my bar for what's possible lowered considerably after January 6th in the United States. Never really thought in my lifetime that I would see a sitting US president call for the overthrow of an election. So I'm not going to say that it's impossible. What I will say is that two things. Number one, this does not seem to me to be part of a strategy for re-election. The revocation of the recall election was something that he promised from the very beginning. He's fulfilling his promise, but it does not seem to advance the cause of re-election. And I don't see any other signs in what AMLO is doing that he really seriously is considering this. And secondly, as Javier said, Mexico is different from countries where this has happened. Re-election has been fundamentally ingrained in the Mexican culture and in the Mexican Constitution since the era of the founding of the Constitution itself. In Porfirio Diaz's sort of left a legacy that has actually benefited Mexico in some ways. So I don't really think that's a serious concern. Remind me again what your the second part of your question is?
What about the weakening of INE?
The weakening of INE, yeah.
Mexican democracy?
Well, as you know, we've done this survey on perceptions of the INE and perceptions of democratic institutions in Mexico. And about 60% of the Mexican public, the citizens in general, do have confidence in the INE and have confidence in elections in Mexico. But the fact that only 12% of Morena followers feel the same confidence is concerning. It suggests that there is an audience for claims in the future if Morena were to lose an election, which it has not done in the last 2 elections, that there would be an audience believing that in fact the INE had done something nefarious and that there had been fraud in the election, regardless of whether there was any evidence of it. You see a similar phenomenon in the United States right now, where close to 2/3 of Republicans believe that Joe Biden did not win the election. So this is certainly possible. The confidence that people have in electoral institutions is only important insofar as it explains whether or not they would follow somebody who claims that the election needs to be overturned. And so there is a need for someone to lead a movement claiming that the elections need to be overturned. Now, I don't think that Morena is likely to lose the 2024 election. But if they were to, that would be the moment at which the lack of confidence in the INE would come into play. Most countries have varying degrees of confidence in electoral institutions, and there are always some who don't believe that electoral institutions are fair. But I think that at this point, there is enough confidence in INE and the rest of the population that there would be resistance, even in the catastrophic scenario that Morena loses, claims fraud, tries to overthrow the election. There would be a lot of people who would not believe it and who would enforce the results of the election. So that is all good news for democracy in Mexico. I think that there probably will be some additional attacks on INE as the renovation of the counselors of the INE takes place over the course of the next year. As both of the other panelists know, there is some question as to whether Morena is going to be trying to influence the selection of the counselors in such a way that they can control the INE more than they have done in the past. And we don't yet know how that process is going to work out or what it will do to the confidence in that the opposition, the current opposition has in the INE. So I guess that's what I have to say about the INE.
Thank you, Kate. Blanca and Javier, Monica Lewis asking, I mean, yes, this is about the 2024 election, but what about this year elections and next year elections? I believe that, I mean, if there's a lot of people coming and to vote, that will strengthen Morena. But I wonder what is your take on this year and next year? And Blanca, in general, I mean, who wins, who loses, and what would you do, Blanca, if you were an opposition leader? I mean, what would be the strategy? Yes, I agree with you. It's not about being in San Angel or including the reality, just plotting against.
Although San Angelin is a very nice restaurant. I've been there. It's
the nicest, the nicest. And I have no association whatsoever with that in any way, except liking it, you know, as a customer.
what is what you would like to, I mean, this is about Mexican democracy. This is about having contested elections. And what would you do if you were an advisor to the opposition?
Well, firstly, let me just share with our audience the numbers. You know, according to Consulta Mitofsky, 69% of the population wants the recall vote. And even among those that oppose Andrés Manuel López Obrador, 44% want the recall vote. Those are pretty high numbers. So it seems to me that there was more of a possibility of using this exercise in terms of the opposition for growing and going against López Obrador, which is basically what they've been doing. They have no program, no proposal, nothing except just anti-Andrés Manuel. So in a way, this was a very good setting to exercise their muscles, like go to the gym, right? And see how much, use it as Andrés Manuel was using it, to see how much muscle they have, how much muscle to get out the vote, their vote. And they decided not to do that. If I were advisors to the opposition, I would say, yes, you know, let's try to do it. And I would try to, you know, use these numbers and show, even if we lose, I'm assuming here that I was on the opposition, this is an assumption, not a reality, is that we would get super important information, data moving forward de cara al 2024. Let me just say something about the re-election issue. I completely agree with both Javier and Kathleen, and I really like the way Kathleen put it, as, you know, after January 6th for her in the US, you know, everything is possible, or the bar lowered. And I tend to agree, you know, one cannot, you know, be certain at this point, it's purely speculative. But I completely agree with both that I have never seen Andrés Manuel wanting to re-elect himself. And part of the reason I think this is that he has completely internalized what I consider to be the golden rule of Mexican politics throughout most of the 20th century, which was the temporal control of power. That's the strongest limit to power in Mexico that I think was a fundamental key to political stability, was precisely the non-re-election rule and principle, which nobody, since it was established, has at least explicitly attempted to go against. And I think he, in many ways, have broken with some of the basic rules of the Mexican political system, which we might call priista or just Mexican, because that's what we have. But this one in particular, I think, is very central to him. And there's many ways in which he has shown us that political stability and avoiding violence and, you know, is very important. And in that sense, I completely agree with my colleagues. I don't know, what was your last question? Sorry, I forgot.
That how will be the likely impact of this recall in this year's election and next year's election? I mean, my take on this, Blanca and Javier, is that most likely the recall vote will strengthen the power of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So then the question will be, I mean, what he will do with this power in the next 2.5 years. I mean, how will this affect the end of the presidency? Let's face it, I mean, he has 2.5 years to go. And if we have a candidate from Morena in the next year, it's going to be very interesting, because we all know that the rule, the pre-rule was, once the incumbent decided who will run, then his power will diminish. So I mean, these are all, I mean, there are some lessons from the past, but it's hard to see what is going to happen in the next 2 years, because apparently this is really helping Andrés Manuel to become more strong.
Okay, I see that point, and I think it is important. I continue to think that the most important thing is the general rehearsal and exam for the political operatives, or the governors in particular, in the face of 2024. For me, that is the central objective. But in terms of whatever, you know, gain he can personally get from this recall vote moving forward for the last part of his administration, he's been very clear. You know, he wants 3 things. He wants 3 constitutional reforms: the reform in the energy sector, particularly in electricity, today we have a key vote in the Supreme Court, as you all know, on that matter. Then the second is the big electoral reform, which would essentially, alter INE as we know it, destroy INE as we know it, the National Electoral Institute, and the one having to do with the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard, and making it part of the Ministry of Defense. He's announced this since the day after the intermediate elections, now the midterm elections, and also, finishing up his main projects and continuing the signature and flagship programs, social programs of his administration. I think one last possible objective of the recall vote is that this would apply to the next president. And it could perhaps be used by Andrés Manuel López Obrador as a way to keep that person in reign, kind of like to exercise some kind of control. So you are a good Morenista. We won't perhaps even make the recall election, just as he did with Claudia, by the way. Claudia Sheinbaum, there was, it was programmed to have a recall, but nobody's talked about it anymore. So, it could be like that. If you are a good amlista, if you're a good Morenista, we won't do a recall vote, or we could do it and help you win it. If you're not a good amlista, then we could do the recall vote and not help you win it. I don't think that Andrés Manuel is going to be as previous pre-presidents. I think the political capital and the absence of any sort of institutionalization in Morena makes him a pivotal piece of politics after 24.
Thank you, Blanca. This is very important. And Javier, let me come to you. So we've seen again a maximato, a amlato. There's some noise out there, but let me ask you, Javier, so would you agree with Blanca that this could have some impact in the 2024 and beyond in terms of AMLO's power?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. He hasn't institutionalized Morena. So Morena is a mess. And if it's a mess with him as president, imagine what Morena would be like after 2024 with Claudia Sheinbaum as president, or a Marcelo Ebrard as president, or a Monreal as president, or
Adán Augusto, most likely.
Exactly, as whoever you pick, Morena will be even more of a mess. So I suspect that López Obrador will remain present as the final arbiter of any disputes, etc., etc. And for that, he needs to be popular. For that, he needs to demonstrate his capacity to mobilize people, etc., which this is the recall referendum is part of that. It is also an anti-lame duck strategy, very, very clearly. And that anti-lame duck strategy goes beyond 2024. Let me just say a few things about something that Blanca said. I agree that people seem to want the recall referendum, but that doesn't speak to the intensity with which they want it. And they may make an extreme argument here. If you ask people, do you want presidential elections? I suspect 97% of people would say yes. But then 45% of those people go out and vote. Yeah. So it's not that clear to me that there was a huge opportunity for the opposition to mobilize. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, but it's not that clear. But she's absolutely right that there could have been a possibility for the opposition to show their strength, and also to do what López Obrador is doing now. Let's begin to try and organize ourselves and mobilize people and have presence within the entire territory. And it would have been, whatever happened in the referendum, it would have been a tremendous help for them going forward in 2024, especially as there is an option of there's a huge difference between asking people not to vote and asking people to vote and spoiling the ballot. So you could have asked people, they didn't have to say to vote against López Obrador, just against the tool and the way it's being used by López Obrador, by spoiling the ballot. So that there were options, I think interesting options, that the opposition could have explored and decided not to. I suspect it has a lot to do with laziness, as Blanca says, but I also suspect it has to do with the fact that they're confused about who they are and what they want. So maybe they're working hard, but going round and round in circles, like sort of dingoes at sunset, because they have no idea who they are and what they want. So I think the problems they have go beyond laziness, because laziness might disappear as 2024 gets nearer. But the other stuff, the confusion won't disappear as 2024 gets near. As far as this year's election, I think they're key. I think AMLO, it was clear for him in 2021, people focused on Congress, and the opposition focused on Congress, thinking that is the key way to offer a check and balance to the fourth transformation and López Obrador, etc. But I think López Obrador was more interested in territory, because he needs that control of territory going forward to 2024. And I think he'll get more of that territory this year and perhaps more next year. And that is essential for winning 2024. And I think the rest of his sexennial, the next 2 years, is all about winning 2024. It's clear that he won't deliver materially, let's say. There won't be significant or spectacular results in a material, concrete sense, as far as his new airport, as far as the Maya train, whatever, even if he builds them, right? What he needs to do is win 2024. That's what it's all about, I think, for now, from now on, for López Obrador.
Thank you, Javier. Hey, there's two questions in the Q&A. One about, what is the take of Washington? Is Washington worried about López Obrador getting too much power? And there's another one about the militarization of Mexican public policy. Are you worried about Guardia Nacional being everywhere? I just been visiting, for example, the National Institute of Immigration, and I can tell that now most of the delegates are from Guardia Nacional. It's almost everywhere. So what is the likely impact of this militarization of many areas of public policy in Mexico, in Mexican politics?
Well, the same survey that we did showed broad popular approval of the armed forces and acceptance of activities that are not normally or should not normally be part of the armed forces purview. So from the point of public perceptions, I think that militarization is not yet on anybody's radar as a potential danger to democracy in Mexico, but it is occurring, and the military is taking over functions, building the airport, things that would not normally be the responsibility of the armed forces. And I find this quite troubling, especially in the context of growing violence. You said that homicide rates in Mexico are extremely high, higher now than they are in Colombia, and that this comes along with a lot of potential human rights abuses. We've seen militarization, which has been thankfully absent for much of Mexico's contemporary history, bring down other countries, not in the traditional sense of a military coup, though, but in terms of influence over the political life of the country and influence over politicians. And I do think that that is a serious risk. I don't think it has anything to do with the recall, or that it will influence one way or another whether the recall works. I do want to say that we've been talking mostly about the short-term and medium-term effects of this recall vote. But I want to mention that this is not a short-term fix. There have been changes to the Mexican Constitution, which will allow future recall votes as well going forward. There's a very particular time frame attached to that. They can only happen for a 3-month period after the midterm point of the president's term. But we really don't know how this might be used in the future. It could be used, as Blanca says, to threaten Morenistas to stay in line, but it could also be used against presidents who are from other parties in the event that another party wins the election as a kind of a second chance. If you lose the election, come after the president at this midterm recall. It's not clear yet how that will influence the way that presidents operate. Knowing that this could happen in their 4th year, does this influence the way that they manage policy? Does this influence their planning? Does this influence their attitudes towards the political opposition in the period prior to the potential recall election? But this is a long-term fix to a short-term problem. And in the law of unintended consequences suggests we ought to keep an eye on this.
Any reaction about Washington? Or Washington?
I don't think Washington is paying any attention whatsoever to Mexico. None at all. Everything is about Ukraine. And if the president of Mexico were named Zelensky, maybe he would get a look in at the conference meetings in Washington. But this is a historic pattern. The United States pays attention to Mexico only when there's a crisis. Although if you watch Fox News, there is a crisis at the border. There's a crisis of immigration. But even there, I don't think that there's a lot of attention to what's going on in Mexico and the potential risks to Mexican democracy. And, you know, this has been one of my lifelong frustrations as a scholar of Mexican politics, that every now and then people care. And then the rest of the time, they're like, you tell them that there's a problem here, look out, and nobody cares. Washington does not pay enough attention to Mexico, given its importance to the United States as a trading partner, as a, you know, our populations are integrated. I mean, I could go on, but I really don't think Washington is paying much attention to this.
Thank you, Ken. I will slightly disagree with you. I believe there's some attention, but you're right. I believe there's some negligence, but I also will say there's going to be less tolerance from Washington to Mexico, because now, I mean, they're busy with other things. Blanca, I mean, we're academics, it's about to think, and you've been telling us that this is a very important exercise for the 2024 election. To them, Kate and Javier, and you have mentioned, I mean, this is going to have long-lasting consequences. How you see 2030? I mean, it's let's speculate about it. It's let's talk about 2030. It's are we going to have a maximato? It's not Calles, but it's López Obrador, and then what that will mean for Mexican politics? Could you speculate on that on 2030, Blanca?
Okay, let me address your question through a different lens.
Okay.
Because the underlying lens is kind of democracy versus non-democracy, or limited democracy, or threats to democracy. And that's much of the conversation going on in Mexico among, at least, you know, analytical circles. I was recently rereading a book by Stephen Skowronek on the American presidency and different types of presidencies. And the first one he conceptualizes is what he calls transformational presidencies. And they aim to construct a regime that is trans-presidential term. And actually, Reagan did it. We're still living under the shadow of Ronald Reagan in the United States, in a sense. Or Trump was, you know, the break of that circle, of that long phase. Salinas did it in Mexico. So you could call it maximato, you can call it transformational presidency. It changes completely the way you look at it. I think Andrés Manuel is a transformational presidency, and he wants to have a a structure of power and how power is exercised, and a series of goals towards which presidential power, political power more generally, is used that outlasts him as president. And he's trying to set up things so that is possible. And for instance, the role of the military is critical in that project to sustain that. Many of the things he does for the people, for the majorities, are also key, from the social programs to things like the recall vote, right? And trying to keep them mobilized. And here, let me just end on Machiavelli, which I think is the bedroom reading of Andrés Manuel, the most important one. And he said, to the prince, there's 3 sectors that you need to, be careful about and decide who you want them to back you. And one are the nobles, the other one is the people, the masses, and the other one is the military, the coercion, those that are in position of legitimate coercion. And he said, the surest is the people. The surest is the people with the military. The least, the more problematic, challenging, and potentially threatening to your rule is just depend on the nobles. Ask Peña Nieto. The nobles deserted him. And so Andrés Manuel has the 2 key pieces to rule, and to perhaps rule beyond his presidential term. Thank you,
Blanca. Very important assessment. Javier, I believe you agree that Andrés Manuel is going to be a transformative president, and we're going to have a lasting legacy. Could you help us understand what is going to be the most important lasting political legacy of Andrés Manuel López Obrador? And we're only 5 minutes to finish, so this will be your last opportunity to say something. So if you want to wrap up and say something about this, and I will give the floor to Kate and Blanca. So go ahead, Javier, please. And thank you again for being with us.
No, thank you. Thank you all. I agree that he is attempting a transformational presidency. The dilemma he faces in trying to do that is that he has chosen a populist strategy. And the problem there is that populism erodes institutions. And so if you're trying to transform the Mexican political system, eroding institutions without replacing them with new institutions, how do you achieve the institutionalization of the new system? So certainly he can destroy or erode the previous one, but it's not at all clear, given his populist strategy, how he can create a new one. Because I would argue that a key characteristic of populism is that it operates above, around, beyond whatever institutions. And I would argue that one of the reasons he has used the military has to do with that. Given that he believes in operating in a direct way, connecting with the people, not the nobles, with the people directly above his own party, and he can continue to do that after 2024, he still needs institutions to exercise power. He has decided not to use the ones he has as chief of the executive. He has decided not to use Morena because he hasn't institutionalized Morena. So the one option was the military, given that his bet is that they are highly institutional and they follow orders. And he has used the military in the way that the Salinas modeled use autonomous institutions. From Salinas on, they started creating again and again and again technocratic institutions to operate, to exercise their power, right? He doesn't clearly want to do that, but he still needs to exercise his power. And given that his populism erodes institutions, he's using the military for that. Whether he can still connect with the military once he's no longer the commander-in-chief, because after 2024, he will no longer be the commander-in-chief. I still think that the Mexican military is highly institutionalized, so I'm not that clear that he will still be able to command the military once he's no longer commander-in-chief. So he has a challenge going forward. He should try and institutionalize Morena with him on top, after 2024 if he wants to remain relevant. And I think we will see some of that happening after he leaves the presidency.
Thank you, Javier. And we all know that about the military, that they still quite popular in Mexico. So that's very unique. Not unique, but I will say it's something that is to bear in mind. There's a lot of questions about the electricity reform, about the political reform, and about what is the meaning of this militarization of Mexico. We'll come back, we'll organize webinars on this. It is important to reflect on this. And but now let me give the floor to Kate and to Blanca to finish this. Your 1 minute last comment, please, Kate and Blanca.
Yeah, just one thought actually going forward is that by 2030, it is possible. I think the more likely scenario than an immediate re-election would be for Morena, if it wins the presidency, to attempt to secure a non-consecutive re-election. Now, AMLO is old enough that that's a problematic scenario for him to come back, but it would create the kind of environment that we see in the United States, where a president who's out of power retains a lot of influence over candidate selections in a variety of local and state elections, based on the possibility that he could come back and run for election again. So that is something that I would keep an eye on going forward as to whether there's any movement towards that. It's happened for the Congress. It's happened for local elections. So that might be a model to follow in the future and something that people should keep an eye out for.
Thank you, Kate. Blanca.
Yes, I want to thank you again. It's been a great conversation, especially for the students that might be listening to us. I think that what we're living in the world, not only in Mexico, but certainly in Mexico with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is I think it's a fabulous opportunity to think about politics, to think hard about politics, to remember that there's not only one way of looking at politics, that this opposition, democracy, autocracy is one, very important, but not the only one. Let me bring out another political realist and say that Samuel Huntington, in that incredibly good book, Political Order in Changing Societies, where he said the most important difference among countries is the degree of government. So going back to think about politics candidly, without so much moralism, and going back to some of the sort of basic tenets of political realism might do us good in thinking about politics at this time. And because I'm a bit concerned about the laziness here, analytical, in a lot of commentary in Mexico, a lot of analysis in Mexico, not thinking hard enough about, what is this about? Why are we here? And what is the future likely to hold for us? And I think for students of politics, and to people who, like us, I'm sure, that think that politics is important and has this fundamental role to play in human life.
Thank you, Blanca. No doubt that, if you want to transform the countries about the political arena, forget about anything else. Thank you, Blanca. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Javier, for what I will say, very thoughtful discussion. Thank you all. Muchas gracias.
Bye. Gracias. Un gusto.
Thank you all for being here. Gran gusto. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.